park them on the grass, and start a major fire. Oh no. So we did a lot of disaster preparation, and I spent a big chunk of the eclipse just being like, okay, please, let's not have this go to a worst case scenario. Let's just have it be fun and joyful science. And I'm so happy that like the only disasters coming out of it were things like people putting sunscreen on their eyeballs, which I was deeply hoping that was a myth and I could check Snopes and have it be debunked, but no. Or like the number of cameras met a very unfortunate end. Like there's a couple camera rental stores, equipment rental stores that have just like the amazing breakdowns and teardowns of the photos, all the ways people killed their cameras.
Well, I was working for, back before I had the books out, I was working for Duke Energy in the run-up to right around the year 2000, so Y2K and all of that craziness, when we didn't know the world wasn't going to end, so everybody was running around being very careful.
The reason it didn't is because good preparation is the only good preparation means that you don't notice the disaster that didn't happen.
Right.
I will point out that my slightly special family, which is composed of preppers and survivalists.
Mine too. I think it's a requirement to be in the family.
It did have full survival gear and full plans of escape routes when the world inevitably collapsed, but because specific Christian borderline cult also came up the side of, well, this is when they're going to start persecuting us, so we're going to have to flee into the wilderness and survive. And
mine was
I think they were disappointed when that didn't happen.
Yeah, mine was completely prepped for the imminent communist invasion in 1974.
You see, I didn't come from a prepper family at all. We're just extremely pragmatic. It's one of my first memories is of the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in San Francisco, and we just kind of went from there. And disaster preparation doesn't necessarily mean being a prepper. It means being like, oh, bad stuff happens. Disasters happen everywhere. There is no safe space. Like, that is not a thing that exists on this planet. All you have is disasters you are more or less comfortable with.
Well, see, that's the practical thing. Preppers are looking forward to it.
Yes.
Yeah, I admit I really don't like actually experiencing disasters. I really enjoy it when we manage to do enough prep that everyone's like, oh, that wasn't so bad. And that's like, I'm seeing that with
James going to make us talk about the topic.
Redirecting to the topic, as much fun as this is. So I want to start out talking about post-disaster rebuilding from a fairly personal scale, because one of the things we were discussing before the panel is how much the individual mindset and the community mindset play into surviving and recovering from an apocalypse. And I saw this firsthand, and it's what kind of kicked me into what I'm currently studying, where my community got hit by these fires, and it was declared a Type 1 federal disaster. And the National Guard came in, was there for a day, took a look at the community, and was like, there's literally nothing for us to do. We'd organized running evacuations, we were getting the livestock out, we had multiple groups running trains to bring livestock out, because ranching community, that's as important as the people. And we had hay brokers from the valley bringing supplies of feed in. All the local stores were managing everything. And the National Guard literally had nothing to do. The law enforcement was starting to get bored. So the community plays a huge, huge part in disaster response. So I want to talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, so community resilience is like one of the most effective ways to predict whether or not a group of people will survive a disaster. And this is why when I'm talking to people who have like no disaster plans at all, where they're like, I know I should put together a kit, but it seems like a lot of work, and if I give a mouse a cookie, I'm going to have to like do a kit and a plan and contact info and trade out my water, and it's just too much. And I go, okay, what I want you to do is I want you to throw a party and invite all of your neighbors. That is my first intro starting tip for disasters. Because what happens when you invite all of your neighbors to a party, they come in, they see where your home is, they probably figure out where your bedroom is. If you're in a small little apartment and they put the coats on the bed, they'll know exactly where it is you spend a third to a quarter of your time, and know where to dig for you in case of true disaster. They know your names. When they all have to suddenly evacuate and they're standing in the street, they notice you're missing. They know if you have pets or children or elderly or people who are have limited physical ability to take themselves out, and they care. When you have a disaster, the first responders, the immediate first responders, are always your neighbors. It takes time to get the organized people in and the trained people you rely on first. So if you're not sure where to start in disaster response, start with a house party. And if you do the house party under the premise of, hey, by the way, I hear this increases our odds for survival, then you've got the beginnings of like an actual neighborhood response team, and you can bring in trainers and have volunteer coordinated meetings and all of the rest of it. It's like it snowballs from there.
Yeah, one of the things that makes me really crazy are the TV shows like Survivor, where it's all one person against everybody else, and let's get everybody off the island, and it's all the backstabbing and all for one and one for one. That's not going to get you very far in the long run. It's the community that survives, and there's a real reason why when you look back through history, every time people have migrated, they've done it in groups. Yes, there may have been scouts and there may have been hunters that go ahead and figure out the path, but when people move, they move together because it increases their likelihood of survival. And when you break society back down and you lose all those modern conveniences, you're going to need a broad variety of skill sets, and you can't possibly have them all yourself. So this means that you can't be the asshole loner who is out there with his shotgun going to menace anybody. And good luck with that. We're better off without you. The rest of us will form a community and survive, and we'll just leave you over there.
So there are, taking things to the science end of things, one of the more, evolution is always it's a tricky thing to get like actual hardcore data and be like, this is a thing that is real. Evolution is real, the conclusions aren't always as well supported. So one of the theories is this idea that the whites in our eyes help us coordinate what we're looking at. So you can tell I'm looking over here right now without me saying anything about it. If we all know where we're looking, we can all non-verbally communicate as a team to do a thing, such as deal with the big bad monkey who's messing with all of us. All of us teeny tiny little monkeys can stare at him and be like, 1, 2, 3, let's go! Take you on! So doing the big bad and burly is not really an effective survival strategy, and you might even, again, I wouldn't say it's extremely robust data. There's other things that some species don't have that and still have coordinated action and blah, 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 blah. Let's debate it, but...
And I think one of the things that always strikes me when you have a disaster, whether it's like we're seeing with Harvey or with Katrina or with 9/11 in New York, especially after 9/11, New Yorkers have such a rep for being aloof and paying no attention to anybody else. And it's a lie. I mean,
but it's a reputation.
But it's a reputation. And yet we saw so much community just come forward. Everything from people who had power running outlets out so people could charge their phones, assuming you could get a cell signal, to people bringing in water, to people opening their pizza shops to make pizza for the first responders. I mean, or giving rides. I mean, it was just such an amazing outpouring. And that's where you see, I think, humanity's survivability.
Yeah, so the term for it is either an emergent volunteer or a spontaneous volunteer. Technical jargon is going to change depending on who you're talking to. We haven't really settled on it yet. And we're just this is one of the coolest things happening in disaster planning right now, is learning how to build your plans around these spontaneous volunteers. So when things go wrong, you're going to have the helpers. Mr. Rogers totally had it right, where you're going to have the helpers who are going to come out and going to try and do things. And the job of the emergency planner is to figure out how to make it happen in an effective manner. Because otherwise we end up with things like Fort McMurray fires in Canada. We had huge stockpiles of donations, which was awesome because we lost the northern city and people evacuated with a purse with a candy bar and a pair of keys. They had nothing. But when we had all these physical object donations, we didn't have the human power to sort it. We didn't have the distribution capacity. We didn't have the buildings to put things in. It was not the most useful way to channel that goodwill and that desire to help.
So one of the projects that I work on is actually with the University of Harrisburg. They wanted to do some disaster response to kind of start developing soft skills in some of their students. And so we actually put together a RPG / kind of LARP, but mostly RPG, about disaster response, based in a fictional country, kind of used, the Sokovia. It's somewhere over in like the Soviet area, former Soviet area. But we developed it so that, you have these disasters, and then at certain points that triggers future disasters, and so you have things continuing to get worse, you have political, all of these big things. But one of the things that we discovered that people don't quite process is that initial delay, where you have a minimum of usually about 2 days, and in more remote areas, more than that, before organized response actually starts coming in.
72 hours.
So you have to get an understanding of what your own resources are, what your skills are. If you have the ability to organize people in a disaster, you have a lot of people who have a lot of nervous energy and fear, especially right when it's happening. Everyone is on edge. There's a lot of nervous energy, and that can turn bad really, really fast. They're looking for an outlet. They're looking for an escape, and if you don't direct that, it can turn into violence. It can turn into a lot of issues arising. But if you're able to organize them into, all right, so we've got a bunch of people here with cars, we still have a lot of evacuations that need to happen. Here's a roster with who's going where. All right, who has food, who has cooking abilities, who has childcare abilities. You put older people and people who don't have the ability to get out into the disaster zone in charge of things close to home.
Well, and don't forget that if you've lost power, everybody has a freezer full of chicken that they need to cook soon. So it's not an issue of hoarding this chicken that's going to go bad as soon as your freezer gets warm. It's let's all pull out the camp stoves and the barbecue grills and cook this stuff and feed everybody while we have it. So, I think that's also part of, there's this scarcity mentality that gets especially played up in TV and dystopian novels, where everybody grabs theirs and hoards it. You do not want to hoard rotting chicken. You need to share this. And while you're sharing it, you can make all those plans and see who has what resources.
Yeah, it's so then that also gets into from the immediate response to the longer term recovery. And response to recovery, so disasters get divided into mitigation, preparation, response, and recovery. We say those are the 4 zones, except for they really overlap. For example, right now Harvey is transitioning from the immediate life-saving response into the recovery of fixing things now they're not actively going wrong. But when doing recovery, that's the perfect time to also start mitigating for the next round of disasters. And a beautiful example of this is in Canada and Calgary. We had there's a river runs through the city. A river runs through it, and it has huge floods very frequently. Enough that there's Canadian songs written about it that nobody else has heard of. Our culture. We send out our musicians, we send out our entertainers, our comedians, but we don't send out our disaster music. It's tragic. We have a great song about trucks getting stuck.
Oh, come on, we've got the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald.
And we had New Orleans is sinking. Anyway, getting back on topic. So there's the city, it floods frequently, and finally they got a mayor who was like, oh, this is enough. And after the last set of floods, he decided that their recovery would be, they'd spend their recovery money on making things better and mitigating it and changing the zoning and doing things like, instead of having the housing in the flood zones, let's have the parks in the flood zones. And just rearranging everything. And then the next set of floods came and it was like, oh, this ain't so bad. So it's that basic premise of every dollar spent in mitigation and preparation is $10 saved in recovery. Well, if you're spending the $10 in recovery, make it do double duty in your mitigation and preparation at the same time.
Well, and I think, and going back to that whole idea of who are the people in your neighborhood can be much larger than you think it is. Back when Katrina hit, Hurricane Rita came close on the heels and hit the Galveston area and flooded a lot of Texas. There's a department store chain that was based in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I'm from, Belk's, and they had just purchased a number of smaller department stores in that Texas area. And when Rita hit, they mobilized. This is a department store chain, people. They mobilized. They had people volunteering from all of their stores throughout the Southeast. These people were getting trucks from friends, semi-trucks. They were calling vendors and getting blankets and pillows and underwear because, they're a department store. They sell this stuff. They got trucks into the affected area faster than FEMA and the Red Cross. And these were just people who called the people in their cell phone that they work with every day and said, all right, we've got affected people. I need cases of underwear, or bottled water, or pillows, or blankets. And they not only mounted getting supplies into the affected area, they also made it a point, they found all of their people. Now, if you remember how much people scattered and had to move away and people went missing, they found 1,500 of their associates scattered throughout the West, and didn't stop until they knew everybody was safe, everybody had what they needed. They had people who went looking for the elderly parents of associates in that area. They had people who camped out in the stores that got flooded to make sure stuff didn't get stolen. And it was all volunteer driven. These were people walking up and going, hi, I'm here, how can I help?
Yeah, it's one of those things where you can't have just the government doing response. It's not going to work, is that the government does not have enough people employed full-time dealing with just sitting around waiting for disasters, and there'd be a certain amount of public disgruntlement if there were. So you do need to have emergent and trained volunteers, you do need to have non-government organizations, and you do need to have companies all pitching in during a disaster. And you see that, like, there's a bunch of money matching going on right now for Harvey, just like ridiculous amounts of money matching. But there's also things like beverage companies. If you look at Anheuser-Busch, they have responded by switching all of their beer canning into water.
Yeah.
Since
So we'll have
1988, they have done every single U.S. disaster of being just like, never mind, forget the beer, let's do water. Right now in Harvey, the heavy equipment companies, so Caterpillar is donating generators into the disaster zone and started mobilizing all of their heavy lifters and their heavy equipment to clear it, because they have trained operators, they have the equipment, they make the equipment, they're bringing it in. The hardware stores, it's Home Depot, has 400,000 of their employees are also on the disaster volunteer teams, and they go in and they help rebuild after every disaster. So they've got $1 million of donated time going to Harvey right now. So
Well, we live near one of the places where the power companies and Duke Energy concentrate all of their linemen and all of their recovery trucks and mass them out by the Charlotte Motor Speedway and then deploy them wherever the power's out.
And one of the things that we're starting to see more is social media is having a huge impact on how disaster response happens. From, like she mentioned, you've got all these big companies. Well, it's now a really great marketing tool. Back before social media, you'd get some of it in the news, but it tended to be fairly localized when something like this was happening. Now, we'll use HEB as an example. It's a big chain down in the Texas area. I don't know where all their spread is, but one of the things that I've seen really shared around social media is, here's the HEB convoy. You know, they've got kitchen trucks, they've got just semis full of supplies, and they were just staged right outside the disaster area ready to come in. Well, that's fantastic marketing. The goodwill for that is huge. In the fires in my community, one of our main feed stores, because again, agricultural community, was like, all right, so we're opening up all of our delivery trucks are making drives out to any of the ranches that are acting as shelters for the livestock. We're bringing food, we're bringing halters, all of these things. But anything that people are donating will match. That's huge in a small community because there's not a lot of money. There are a lot of people who are already on the edge of disaster. You lose a month's worth of feed, you can't keep your horse, you can't keep your livestock, and it takes a long time, especially in California in the summer, for feed to regrow. So they're like, we're matching this. But a couple of the other feed stores wouldn't deliver. They wouldn't match anything. They were doing nothing to help out. The business hit that those stores took versus Lee's Feed, which helps match everything, was huge. Lee's moved themselves into this position of, we are your community store. And their business picked up. So there's a very strong social component that is also marketing. Social media can also be used to organize things within your community. But the bigger thing, going back to what Mika said about the disaster response from the government level, is that while they may come in almost immediately, they can't just sit there through the long tail. And you are spending, with a disaster like Harvey or Katrina, you spend decades recovering from that. Katrina is still impacting people. You also run into issues where, like with the Red Cross, you have so much overhead that there's a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of churn within the organization. And so a lot of the time, things don't happen that should happen. And if the community is organized enough to come in and fill these things, the old concept of barn raisings. A bunch of community members get together and put together a barn for someone. You can do that for houses. You have contractors, you have builders, and if you organize those things, you can recover from disaster much more efficiently sometimes than you can with waiting for other people to rescue you.
Well, even some of the things we saw on social media where calls were going out, who has a boat? We need to get people who are,
Agent Navy.
Which is it's a long-running community organization that went through, and they had a pre-existing relationship. So they had the contact information and all of that. It wasn't just randos with a boat who show up and do whatever they want. It was people acting in an organized manner.
We also had a lot of people, the pet rescue organizations that were getting in there, and specifically that was their niche.
So there's been like this big split in the disaster response community of we want to put limited resources towards the humans, not the animals. But that runs into a problem. You have people who treat and see and emotionally feel their pets as part of their families. And this is the event that is actually going to change that perception. Like Harvey and the response to Harvey is going to shift that, and I'm so excited to see what happens next on it.
People are not going to leave their pets.
They didn't.
Those are their
That
children.
was exactly what happened. Yeah. So I have a question. So we've been talking about bad disasters, high impact disasters, but not true catastrophic regional disasters at this point. So something like the Pacific Northwest Cascadia subduction zone, if it spawns a magnitude 8 or 9 earthquake, it'll take down Seattle, Portland, Vancouver. And this is like a quirk of the Cascadia subduction zone in particular, that specific zone has this tendency of the fault line slips, and it releases that stress, but that builds up more stress on the bit next to it, the locked part next to it. The Cascadia zone, for reasons we don't yet understand, occasionally just goes, oh, that bit slipped, guess what, hit my threshold, this bit slips, this bit slips, this bit slips, and suddenly you have a cascade of magnitude 8 and 9 earthquakes. Multiple, all in the same region, from Northern California to Alaska, within months to years of each other. Because one's not bad enough. I chose to make this place my home.
Same.
But so something like that, if that happens, then we're starting to get into like, this is the end of the world as we know it. But it's still on a regional scale. Like, goodbye Pacific Northwest, I hope you enjoyed it while it lasted, let's all move.
Well, I think, and on the East Coast, we're looking at rising tides.
Yeah, like all coasts out
there
there.
shore.
So there's another one of like, okay, at what point do we stop trying to protect Miami, which is already, like, scientifically speaking, is already toast. We can't save Miami. At this point, we're just, like, we're holding on out of sentimentality. Same with New Orleans and several other cities. They're already gone, and we just are in denial.
And practicality, because the problem is that because we are denying climate so hard, we're not preparing for this. If we had started preparing for this as soon as we saw it happening, we could be starting to move people out. And what we're going to end up having happen is that everyone who can afford to move out will, and we'll end up with the severely disadvantaged communities staying there. In a way, that actually is going to mitigate some of the problems because those communities already have to rely on each other for survival, and their networks are already stronger than the more isolationist upper classes. But we're going to see massive death tolls. We're already seeing that with Harvey, where it's because of ice truck plants and everything else, the most at-risk communities are not going anywhere. But I think in a way, it's almost like for the Pacific Northwest, you have those big cluster cities, but you don't have a ton of like the suburban sprawl.
No.
And on the East Coast, you do have that. So I'm more worried about an East Coast disaster where there's nowhere to move out to, and it just chains across.
I was actually going to do
region.
all right. So even those ones are regional disasters, but
Yes.
I am a doom person. So I want to step it up one more go and go. All right, what if we had a big geomagnetic storm? Because a big geomagnetic storm, it acts like an EMP in the atmosphere, and we've had this happen. 1989 in Quebec, it took down the Quebec power grid for a long time in the winter, it was bad. But we don't have a hardened power grid. Like, it would cost about the amount of a 30-second Super Bowl commercial to harden the U.S. power grid against an electromagnetic storm like this, but we're not going to do it because we're really good at, like, humans are really good at handling high-impact, low-frequency events, as in, I am going to win the lottery and the disaster won't happen in my lifetime. Those are apparently not enough to set up cognitive dissonance. We're down with it. So we're not going to do the preparation. So what happens next? What happens 10 years after the power grid goes down? What happens like 2 days after the power grid goes down?
Well, Las Vegas melts.
Yeah.
If you've seen Life After People, which is just a terrific show on the History Channel to really bring it home, how many things within about 2 months just fail.
Well, so I do think that we're going to have a series of disasters that we're not prepared for. I mean, we've already had all of these things that we've been mentioning. That in California, how many people don't have defensible space around their houses? Like this, if you ever want to hear me just go for half an hour in pure rage, talk to me about the people who let their houses burn down because their neighbors would get better houses out of insurance, and so they're just like, oh, screw it, we don't want to protect the structure. You know, we have all of these things that we know that they happen. Yep. Defensible space has been a thing in California for a long time.
Define defensible space. Are you talking machine gun turrets or, you know?
So if you've got a fire, the easiest way to stop a fire is to have a fire break. So a fire break could be a road, it could be something you cut. On personal property, it means you clear out the junk that acquires nearby. You have enough space from the trees and your house.
No grass, no trees, no burnables.
You clear things out of the way. And sometimes it can be a temporary space. Like there are some places that have it as cleared land that has grass but has sprinkler systems built in. You still then have problems with ash and soot jumping it, but it's a much more, the space is something that you can defend against a wildfire.
But where I was kind of going with that is that there are enough of us at this point who have experienced a smaller scale disaster in some point that, you know, hipsters get a lot of grief for things like, oh, we're growing our own food, we're learning to can, we're doing all these things. But in a way, I think that my generation is actually hitting this point of, we've seen these disasters happen. We've seen the government and the relief agencies absolutely screw us over and over again. We have to have some ability and some knowledge. And so, in a way, we're moving into an older mindset where we do have those abilities to recover if something massive happens, where you do have people who know how to grow and preserve food and raise livestock. So it'll still hurt massively, but I think we're starting to see a little bit of response of, we can't rely on someone else to save us.
So just in terms of like, if you want to have a long-term sustainable recovery when you've had a big population hit or something like that, it's not save the doctors, it's save the veterinarians.
Yes.
Because doctors need all the equipment and all of like the fancy stuff. And vets are used to actually, like, they still have to be generalists and they still have to be able to use limited equipment and all the rest of it. So that's one of my favorite things about looking at a fictional post-apocalyptic thing. I don't want a doctor, I want a vet.
Westerns, they would have, the doctor would also be the vet.
Yeah.
Well, so...
The era of pre-specialization.
Yes. So I do want to move into a little bit about, you know, some of the... So the disasters happened, we're 10 years past. What does society look like, and what are some of the things that have changed if we're talking like a massive electromagnetic storm?
Yeah. So one of the things that really, really, really bugs me about a lot of post-apocalyptic fiction is this concept of huge knowledge loss. And I think there will be huge knowledge loss on things that aren't useful. But we're a species of storytellers. We have used stories to transmit knowledge for a long time. And so, for example, the Nora K. Jemisin Broken Earth trilogy does a really, really good job of this concept of we have held on to stories of survival that we pass on and pass on and pass on, of have your go kit, have your go bag, do these certain types of building structures, all of those. So that's something I think is totally plausible, is that we'll have we will lose knowledge about particle physics, but we'll remember things like fault lines of how to identify and not build on a fault line. Or
Which, to be
that
fair,
when
is
the water
some
goes
knowledge
out,
we could
you
stand
don't
to
run
learn
it.
from right now.
Oh yeah.
I think we'll also see the knowledge transmitted from the groups that we now look at, and they are intentionally retro. So the Amish are going to be very important
Yes.
after the world collapses. Oddly enough, so will probably the Society for Creative Anachronism, and all those people who are big into canning their own fruit.
Yeah,
you know,
hipsters.
the hipsters with their
Farmers
chickens.
market folks,
All of the
urban chickens.
yeah, that's all going to be much more valuable. And I come from northwestern Pennsylvania. We have a lot of Amish folks up there. They're living that pre and post-apocalyptic. They've never left that period.
Yeah.
So they can, you know, and they're nice folks, you know. They have that knowledge base. It hasn't disappeared. It just isn't in the general mainstream, but kind of like going back and saving heirloom seeds. It's
Yes.
still there.
Yes. And I think we underestimate our, like you said, with the knowledge base, we also underestimate our ability to live without some of these things. Like, there's this idea that once the end of the world happens, we'll never recover. I honestly think that we have a really strong network of people at this point, and we have the numbers of people that even if we suffer, you know, I can talk over that. Even if we suffer a massive die-off, we're still going to have so many people who know things and know how to do things that I don't even think we'll lose like particle physics. I think it'll become more contained. We might start looking at something like the old monastery idea, where a lot of it is in books. But I think that one of the first things that we would do as soon as we started reaching equilibrium is noting all of that knowledge down and making sure that we had it preserved. I don't think that we would end up in a place where we're going back to day one and rebuilding the human race.
Well, I mean, like 10 years out, they're not all going to be dead yet either.
Yeah.
Some of the particle physicists are still going to be around. There's enough of them who are in the SCA and who are also hipsters.
There is a lot of crossover in those fields, which is very encouraging.
Yeah. We got to make sure we protect a couple of them. I have no idea where I was going. That just happened.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's kind of interesting that this whole let's get back to basics and remember how to do stuff sort of is cyclical about every 25 years. You know, back in the 70s, I remember when people, the big book was Putting Foods By, and all of a sudden everybody decided canning was cool because it was the hippies and let's get back to nature. And now, you know, the hipsters are back with it. So it's almost like this little hindbrain going, you don't want to forget this stuff. This is important to remember. And it's interesting how that becomes cyclical.
So, since we're starting to get towards over halfway, let's go ahead and take some questions and see what people have. So we'll go ahead and start here. If you have a question, let's go ahead and come to the center and line up, just to make it a little easier since we have a lot of people here. As a reminder, please keep it a question, short and to the point. We have a lot of people who have questions, so let's make sure everyone can get theirs answered.
If you're more than 200 miles away from a disaster, is there ever a time that there is a resource you should send that is not just money?
So there's a lot of work you can do remotely depending on your skill set. So I do satellite interpretation. There is volunteer GIS that will do satellite interpretation for people. If you know the area, you can do volunteer map making. And help get the roads on. So Mapbox is a place that does that. Esri does that. You can do a lot of communications work, particularly things like signal boosting. If you're in a disaster, it is really annoying to sort through your disaster hashtag for everyone being like, good luck and best prayers and everything else. And you're just like, shut up. I need to know whether or not I can evacuate and where the safe road is. And like, so if you signal boost the signal and help suppress the noise, that is really useful. If you help educate people nearby, that is really useful. I also really love it when people use a disaster as the inspiration to prepare their own neighborhood. So go, hey, this is a thing that happened there. It could happen here. Or here's other things that could happen here. Let's go through our response kits. Let's develop our community plans. Let's volunteer and get trained locally and be part of the local response network.
You also get a lot of lists. Like we're starting to see this out of Houston. You know, we need baby supplies. We need all of these specific things. New, don't ever send used. Don't send used clothes. Don't send your cast-offs. Send new stuff. Amazon is a great resource.
Yeah.
A lot of places will make wish lists of what they need, and you just go in, you pay for whatever you can. It's shipped directly there, and you don't have to coordinate it or figure out where to ship
You know,
it.
the other thing here is your 6 degrees of separation.
Yes.
Who do you know? It may be that you have a family member, an old college roommate, a former coworker who is now in a position to do one of those massive corporate grants, or is now the supply engineer for something, head of operations for something. This is where you pull out your personal network and go, who do I know who might really be well positioned to help with this? And then you use your personal ask to make that happen. That is priceless.
Yes. And so the theme here is also do things through channels, don't do things spontaneously off the sides. There's legal reasons for doing this. When you volunteer, you can get covered by Good Samaritan laws in a specific sort of way. But there's just organizational reasons. And that there's this horrible tendency of people in disaster zones to be like, I'm going to volunteer till I fall over asleep because I am the toughest of the tough. And you're like, no, you've just created another problem. Like, now I have to save you too. So you know your limits, stay within them, do it within the proper chain, and trust that other people will help fill the gaps. You're not doing it all on your own.
Yes, sir.
So assuming that is, as you said, 10 years after a really big disaster, regional or countrywide, so what kind of government do we want to have in operation at that point?
At that point, your small local government is going to be hugely important. If you are in a massive disaster, travel and communication are probably going to be difficult at best, if not absolutely impossible. So things are going to need to start small and network out. You're not going to be able to rely on having something big and on the outside. That being said, that is informed by having grown up in rural communities where if a disaster happened, we were unlikely to be able to get to our local government.
You need to have people in charge who value infrastructure and working together, who are accountable to the people they actually govern instead of their donors, because their donors' purposes may be completely different, and they don't want to spend the money on these people who aren't buying their things. So you have to have accountability to the electorate. And you have to have people who give a damn.
So not martial law.
No, it's not going to work. So when you have a major disaster, you're going to have your economics break down temporarily. Again, we're seeing this with like Harvey. How many things are going in there that are being paid for versus how many things are going in and donated time and labor, right? Like that is not a capitalist system at play. That is a cooperative and collaborative system in play. And it's not going to work to do things by brute force, because then you're going to need to spend the time and the energy supporting a military force. And military forces are really like, we use them in disasters because we use them for everything else in disasters except for holding guns, right? Like we use them for their survival chunks, and because so we can send them in safely. So when you have, and this is another thing that like comes into play in fiction quite a bit. When you have a militaristic society, you need a really big population base to support that. Like, try playing Civilization. How many scientists can you have on the side? How many military people can you have on the side, right? And everyone you have is somebody who's not making food and not making useful things. When you're in a resource-limited scenario, you can't afford to have somebody hanging out with a gun. You need them to be sitting there with a hoe or a tractor.
And I think that also goes back to what kind of people do you need in charge? People who have a worldview that cooperation works and that people are not scum of the earth just waiting for their chance to loot things. That is a very small minority. So you need to have people in charge who believe that people will gravitate in the most part to doing the best thing. And that's a worldview issue.
You need collaborative optimists.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
We use the military, specifically the National Guard, for disasters, but
Yeah.
not to enforce a tyranny.
Yeah. We totally, like, National Guard is amazing in disasters, and they do so many fantastic, great things. And
Because
their
they're
job
of the
is
community.
not to enact martial law. Like, that's not why we call it the National Guard.
Yes, sir.
Hi. I just want to know, on these areas and regions where the same kind of disasters happen, why do people keep rebuilding there and just,
So-
I mean, there's a place very well mapped called Tornado Alley, and
Yeah,
you have the
so
Gulf of Mexico, all
there's
this
a couple
stuff.
of things in this. This is a question of hazard mapping and planning and policy. So part of it is that nowhere is safe. Like, if you think your region is safe, I'm sorry, you are just not paying attention to your actual region. Like, everywhere has disasters.
Yeah.
There are places that are more at risk than others, and we are going to continue to put the most marginalized, well, the poorest people go into the highest density in the most marginalized land. And this happens in the United States, and it happens globally. Like, Harvey is a disaster. Okay, now look at Bangladesh, right? Like, the economic disparity there. Then there's a chunk of being able to leave is a privilege. Like, you need money and resources to be able to leave, and that may or may not compensate for the loss of community you have during dysphoria. So when you have refugees leave an area, they get scattered to the winds. It's not easy to be a refugee, and that has multi-generational trauma that continues to impact the children of refugees and the children of the refugees. You look at that, and it has an ongoing impact, even though it is a better life. So it's not easy. It is easier if you look on a local scale where all it takes is political will. But we're not very good at political will because money comes into play. So, for example, when were the flood zones last updated, right? Like, and
where is the housing cheap enough to afford? Gee, it's cheap enough to afford in the flood zone.
or that the policy on flood zones and bridges just got rolled back. Like, there's a bunch of things that happen because money is in play. And if you want to, like, really get a good look, try going to insurance companies for how they do hazard mapping. Because they follow the money in a we don't want to die sort of way.
So, I'm sorry, go
I
ahead.
was going to say, and I think that, as you mentioned, being able to leave is a privilege. When Katrina happened, I was talking with a colleague of mine, and we were hearing these reports about people who would not leave the flood zones, and his comment was, well, they must just be stupid. I can't imagine anybody not leaving that. And I said, Paul, if you up and left your house today, all your money is in a major bank. You could access that from any ATM in the country, right? And your investments, they're with a major brokerage. That's not really anywhere. Now, what if everything you own is in your mattress? What if everything you own is in your apartment? What if you don't even own a car? Are you going to walk away from everything you have if you don't have any way to secure that? People are going to think long and hard before they do that. And I think middle class and up really takes for granted that portability that many people don't have.
So you,
Allow me to just follow up on that. They just lost everything. Why do they go back there? That's my question.
because,
So,
all
okay,
right.
so why do you continue in that location after recovery?
Sometimes
Sorry, I was just
try to
repeating
be
it to Mike
just
because he wasn't in the
right
mic. You can actually, it's okay, I'm sorry.
So, like I said, I grew up in California, which gets fire, storms, earthquakes. We get a lot of stuff. We get landslides. And so I grew up in an engineering family. My grandfather was offered the position of chief engineer of California about 10 years ago. He helped develop the earthquake codes after Loma Prieta and all of the other big earthquakes in recent history. He helped develop those, and so we end up with these massive earthquakes, and everyone's like, oh, why are you going to move to California? It's going to fall into the ocean. And then you get a much smaller earthquake in DC, and the damage is actually significantly worse and recovery takes longer. When you have a disaster area that has recurring disasters, if you have a good government in place, they start taking steps to change that. Again, going back to defensible space. In California, you can be penalized if you don't have defensible space around your house. They check these things. If you're not up to code for earthquakes, you get penalized. So California has done a really good job in a lot of cases of saying, hey, we have these things happen to us. We're going to make sure that the damage is mitigated. We have really strong fire response in place. The teams from all over California can mobilize into the affected region within a day. Like, they have everything ready to go, and if you have a fire in Northern California, everywhere else converges on that. So when you have that goodwill, as was mentioned before, and you start rebuilding but in a better way, it doesn't make sense to move out of there because you might be moving into a region that doesn't have that. But you're also moving into a region where you don't know anything. You don't know where the safe zones are. You don't know anyone to help you in that disaster. And especially if you're marginalized or poor, you might be moving into an area where your lot has just gotten way worse because you don't know anyone and you don't have any stuff. And so it is very much a matter of race, of knowledge, of all of these different things that add up. And yeah, you can move somewhere else, but then somewhere else might get hit by that disaster too.
Yeah, and that there are people who do leave. So, for example, there are people who left Katrina who just got hit by Harvey. Or the Christchurch earthquakes in New Zealand. Christchurch has actually had a population drop during their recovery, which is still ongoing. On the concept of when you have sufficient political will to include mitigation during your recovery, you get situations like in Chile. So Chile is home to the largest earthquake ever recorded in 1960. It was a mag 9.5, I think. It was ridiculous. And they've also had some severe problems with corruption during construction. So they have great building codes, and then people do things like make a pillar out of styrofoam wrapped in concrete. We're like, that's not to code. And they got a really pissed off politician in charge who just effectively threw a temper tantrum at the construction industry. And so they had a big earthquake at 8.3, I think, in 2015. And I was teaching class with international students when it happened, and we had up the earthquake map. And like, I literally stopped class and was like, you and you, go call your family. Like, we'll take a time out. But because this guy had gone through and just forced construction codes, the only death was from a wall that collapsed, just like a backyard wall. That's it. Everyone else was fine. The buildings all broke in ways that protected people.
Simple answer to that question, it's incentive. When there's multiple incentives, higher incentive to stay than to go, you stay. And it could be financial, it could be sociological. There's lots of reasons why you have incentives. But
Yes.
And in answer to your question, sir, I'll call
Sir,
your
did
return
you have a
number.
question?
Yes.
So we're running out of time, so I want to
Sorry.
make sure that we can get all the questions.
Disasters are bad, but disaster recovery institutional knowledge is good. With the guys from Katrina, the Keynesian Navy, they hadn't been used for 13 years. If it had been an extra 10 years, we probably wouldn't have a response. How do we preserve that institutional knowledge?
I love this because Pacific Northwest, we get really big earthquakes infrequently. So we get instead of California where they get a big earthquake every 10 to 20 years, we get an even bigger earthquake but every 300 to 500 years. And you definitely lose that generational knowledge, particularly with people immigrating into the area. One of the ways to deal with it is to include it in curriculums and to include it in structured learning. So you teach the little kidlets things, and then they come home and nag their parents into preparing. The other is to do drills and responses. So like she was saying, of doing effectively large-scale exercises. FEMA does one large-scale exercise each year. This year they actually had two because one of them was classified differently, and I got to hang out during Cascadia Rising. The Washington, Oregon, and Idaho all doing a live-scale response to what would happen if we had a Cascadia zone earthquake. And they pulled in people from these community organizations and included them in that response. I would love it if we could do more of those exercises, if we did different types of them. So right now, if we only have one a year, you can do a big storm, or you can do an earthquake, or you can do a fire, or you can do, right? Like, if we had more money in that, we could do more of those exercises, more of those drills, and get people to practice it more.
But you also have to move beyond cultural ADHD, where people go, well, we don't have one of those every year, so why do I have to take time to do a drill? Okay, because when it hits, it's going to chap your ass if you haven't. So you have to get a cultural understanding that just because something doesn't happen frequently doesn't mean you don't have to prepare for it.
Yeah, FEMA actually has a bunch of classes you can do free of charge that will give you a lot of understanding about how things work during disaster.
And a lot of city communities who do this as well. San Francisco's neighborhood emergency response program is like beyond badass. Like they let me use fire extinguishers and bust open storm drains. It was amazing. And they do a citywide drill twice a year on the anniversary of their big earthquakes where they're like, hey, every single volunteer we have ever trained, come out and play with us. So, and you get to also volunteer to be a victim, which is pretty fun. So check with your local community, see what they're going to do.
All right.
Okay, I have a quick question comment to the audience and then a question for you. We learned a lot in Katrina about the pet situation because people died because the shelters did not allow pets.
Yes.
And then afterwards, nobody knew what to do with the pets. If you lost your home, what'd you do with your pet? So those same networks have been reactivated post-Harvey. A lot of the same people are around. And one of the things that happened is people shipped pets. They did massive convoys and flights of pets to the Northeast. Yes. And so with Harvey, within just a few days, they've been shipping pets to New Jersey and to Birmingham, Alabama. So if you want to know what you can do to help and you're not in a disaster area, check with your local pet shelters and see if they're receiving pets and you can do things to help them. The other question that I have for you that follows up Katrina, there were days that the only really good communication, like you said, there's a good 48, 72-hour delay, was coming from ham radio operators and the very few people that have satellite phones. And I think, you know, the ham radio operators, that's kind of a dying knowledge. No.
Oh, so not.
Okay.
It's coming back.
It's just a
so
pain.
I was just wondering, like,
Right,
what
so,
you see is that first 48-hour communication.
So during Sandy, and this was after I had actually started studying some of this stuff, during Sandy, communication networks were hit really hard. You actually had people pooling resources, so they would bring their printers to someone that had a power source, and they would plug in phones where they created, you know, little flyers on their phone, and they would print them out and have papers, and then they would have people who were mobile go distribute those around with all the information about where you could get food and drink and all these other things. So if you need over more distance, ham radios can be a really good thing. During the fires in my community, we had people, because, you know, ATVs and such, or on horseback, would go out and would go out to rural areas and just be like, all right, we know you may not have heard of this, we're evacuating, we need to get you out, here's where all the resources are. So a community will find a way to communicate, whether that's with setting up phone trees. Phone trees are really useful if you still have that power. Texts, you set up networks. This is where knowing your community can be really, really good. You'll find a way. It will depend on what resources you have and what your needs are and what your physical situation is.
So one thing we saw during Sandy was we started seeing ad hoc networks.
Yes.
So that was when you get enough tech people in one place and you give them a bunch of cell phones, they'll develop the internet, which is pretty fantastic. For hand radio dying off, no, it so isn't, and it's as a journalist, it's my easiest way to interview astronauts. So I'm DA7 SCI. In case anybody ever feels like finding me.
KFRBDF.
So ham radio is still active. You can totally volunteer for it, and it's a really good way, again, of getting that community practice, because often ham radio teams will back up police teams during big urban events. So in Vancouver, during our fireworks festival each year, I love that occasionally they're chanting, we're all going to die, because it's really thematic. Everything about this is amazing. Sorry, go ahead. We'll just move on.
So I'm very interested in sociology, and something I noticed was that for a lot of decades, white-collar jobs and STEM education was the only thing being pushed. Basically saying blue-collar jobs weren't good enough. And so that was like Generation X and Y mostly went after that kind of education. But recently there's a trend where trade skills are being pushed because we don't have enough blue-collar workers. And so for my generation from 2000 and up, a lot of us are probably going to be getting more trade skills and going to vocational schools. Do you think that's going to be very helpful for preparedness and for survival?
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Somebody has to know how to fix things, how to make things, how to jerry-rig things when you can't get the regular parts. Somebody's got to learn, got to know how to do that, and that's crucial infrastructure skill.
And one additional bit, how do you think it's progressing with getting girls into those skills? Because I've taken shop classes before, learning plumbing and electric stuff.
The women,
I was the only girl there.
The women in the community are 100% where you see the initial resources happening. It was 100% the women who sat down and put together the social networks in our fires and were like, all right, we're getting all these resources going, because they had the social networks already set, where the men tended to be more isolationist. The women and the older folks were like, well, we see each other every week for, seniors dinner, or we get together because, we're waiting for our kids
Mobilize the carpool.
Yes.
And you actually see this come into, again, data-based decision-making. You see this come into play in that widowers tend to die as soon as their wives do, because they become socially isolated, whereas the women tend to keep living.
Guys,
but getting into the concept of how do you encourage women to develop technical skills, this is the same problem that happens in all of STEM, which is we're really good at getting girls in, but then we don't support women to stay in. And the easiest, by far, way to increase diversity is to fire the assholes. I cannot get over this enough. I don't care how smart you are. I don't care how many things you've published. I don't care how big your prestige is. If you gift sex toys to your students, you should be fired. Just flat out. That is not a question. So there's that chunk of it. I have very, very strong feelings on this. The other chunk is that, I know, it's like I'm a woman in science working in public and receive rape and death threats on a daily basis. Oh my God. The other chunk of it is that diversity is very, very well supported by data, and that means diversity of jobs, diversity of people, diversity of ethnic background, diversity of gender, everything. The more people you have from more diverse backgrounds, the better your problem solving, the more efficient you are, and the more effective you'll be.
All right, this is
out of time.
Do we have a couple minutes?
Yeah, you can take a couple more minutes.
All right, so we'll just go ahead. If you can keep them really short, these are the last questions we'll take. So go ahead.
Okay, so I live just outside of Portland, Oregon. So obviously, one of the concerns of one of my concerns is a huge quake off of the Oregon or Washington coast, as you mentioned. If that happens and it actually destroys the infrastructure to the point where a whole section of the Pacific Northwest is isolated from the outside world, what could we do as private citizens or communities to restore the transportation infrastructure?
So that is one of those things where, we need to get the roads fixed as soon as possible, and that's a major priority, and even doing things, so if you're outside the region, being able to do map boxing, so looking at the satellite image and being like, those ones are down. If you're inside the image, being able to get the information out, verifying this bridge is still standing, is a huge